Okay, welcome back. I hope you're ready to dive in. I know we are too. This year, we're featuring short case studies at the intersection of climate equity and health. Our first case study is a recent project by Hester Street, which is a local urban planning and development nonprofit organization. They worked with 10 cities across New York State to reimagine code enforcement and how it can improve the health of urban communities by putting equity front and center. Take a look at this case study.
Hello, my name is Jimena Veloz. I'm a project manager at Hester Street. I have a background in urban planning, and I was a project owner of Cities Rise. The Cities Rise project was a project where the New York Attorney General's office used the money that they had gotten from settlements from the banks from the 2008 crisis, and they decided to reinvest that money into communities that had been the hardest hit by the foreclosure crisis. The Cities Rise project particularly was about building the capacity of code enforcement departments across the state to do code enforcement in a more strategic way. Hester Street was brought on to the Cities Rise project to really help the cities think through all of the equity issues that are embedded in code enforcement that cities could really address. When we first started working on code enforcement, some of the things that we were talking about and we were hearing about is that code enforcement disproportionately touched communities of color and lower income communities. We took a really deep dive, and what we learned when a property is in disrepair, a property is vacant, really has to do with a much larger history of disinvestment in communities of color. A lot of the tools of code enforcement are violations, fines, and how do we move away from that? How do we move away from code enforcement being punitive to code enforcement being proactive? Code enforcement officers, traditionally come to a house, do an inspection, and levy a fine. So of course they're not going to be, residents' favorite people. And a big part of this was really shifting what the role of a code enforcement officer is, particularly in climate change. For example, as we talk about climate change and climate disasters, we have also been thinking about how do code enforcement officers become some of those first responders. And I think our biggest takeaway is that, keeping our neighborhoods healthy and keeping homes safe and healthy is a collective job where architects, planners, engineers, we all have a role in making our cities better places and making sure that they're also equitable places where everyone can live.
Okay, to kick off our first panel today, I'm really pleased to introduce Janet Joseph. She's the Senior Vice President at NYSERDA, and I'm so grateful that she's an Urban Green board member. Janet will help lead a distinguished panel discussion on how we prioritize health and equity in climate policy. So Janet, over to you.
Great. Well, good morning. Thank you, John. And it is a pleasure to be here today to moderate this panel discussion focusing on prioritizing health and equity in climate policy. So this topic is certainly a timely topic, and it is a necessary one. We cannot afford to treat energy, climate policy separate and isolated from our broader public policy and social equity goals. And the level of transformation that is needed to achieve our climate goals is huge. And whether we design around optimizing for equity or not, I think we have to realize that the scale alone of the greenhouse gas transformation will affect outcomes in all three arenas for generations to come. So I think we really need to seize this opportunity now and solve now for the multiple environmental and social equity challenges that are in front of us. And that is the conversation that we want to have on this panel. When we think about and when we design our climate policies, we need to put people in the center of our policies. We need to be advancing policies that create better living spaces, better working spaces, and healthier communities. So our climate policies have to be about more than reducing greenhouse gas reductions. So this is certainly an objective that has been put in motion at the state level through the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and through a range of other city policies in New York. And it is up to all of us to bring these aspirational and critical policies to life in a very real world way that help real people, and in particular, individuals who have been historically disadvantaged by our use of fossil fuels. So just a little bit of context for this discussion here today. So let's jump in to the conversation. We have a great panel here today who will share their perspectives on this topic. We have Adriana Espinoza, who's the Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice in the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability. Maritza Silva-Farrell, who's the Executive Director of Align, who will share some on-the-ground perspective from the advocacy movement. Raya Salter, an energy and environmental law and policy consultant and member of the New York State Climate Action Council. And Coll, Director of Energy Affordability and Equity at NYSERDA and member of the Climate Justice Working Group. So we have a great panel, and thank you to the panelists for participating in the conversation. In terms of the structure today of this conversation, each panelist will share their perspective on the issues of integrating health and equity into climate policy, taking about 5 to 7 minutes each. You all participants in this session have access to the bios of the panelists, so I won't go into any more detail on that, but certainly feel free to do so. So after the 5 to 7 minute presentation from each of the panelists, we will then jump into some facilitated discussion among the panel members, and we'll leave time at the end for audience Q&A. So that's kind of the balance of the time that we have. So let's now jump in with the sort of kickoff introductions and presentations. And we're going to start with Coll at NYSERDA. So Chris, over to you. And Chris, I believe, has a few slides to prompt the conversation.
I do. Thanks, Janet. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today with you. I'm just going to pull up my slides here. So, what I wanted to do this morning to start off this conversation is to provide some additional framing on, one of the primary policy drivers for the climate and equity objectives that we have at the state level. And that's, as Janet mentioned, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Those of you who aren't familiar with the Climate Act, here's a quick overview of kind of what it entails, and we'll spend a little bit more time between myself and Raya just talking a little bit more about some of the aspects of the Climate Act. So, as we're thinking about, where we need to go as a state to kind of recognize and realize the aggressive climate goals that we have outlined in the Climate Act, there's a lot of work that has to be done, right? So, the Climate Act outlines, probably one of the most aggressive climate policies for any major economy in the world, and really puts us on a path to carbon neutrality between now and 2025. So there are a number of really important climate and energy goals that are outlined in the Climate Act. So getting to an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050, looking at kind of getting to 100% zero emission electricity by 2040, 70% renewable electricity by 2030, and then significant levels of offshore wind, solar, storage, and energy efficiency over the next several years. to position the state to achieve these goals, the Climate Act also established a Climate Action Council, which my colleague Raya will speak a little bit more about in a few minutes. But equally important to the goals and the Climate Action Council are the equity and climate justice provisions within the Climate Act. So the Climate Act is putting the state in a position to drive benefits to frontline communities, and what the law kind of outlines as disadvantaged communities, and requires representation from communities in the policy making process. So I want to spend a few minutes here just providing a little bit more context with respect to how the Climate Act is kind of outlining the requirements for equity with respect to communities that would be considered disadvantaged under the law. So the Climate Act has established a requirement that a minimum of 35% of the benefits of the spending associated with clean energy or energy efficiency investments be realized by disadvantaged communities, with a goal of 40% of those benefits going to disadvantaged communities. So there's a whole host of investment areas that are relevant under the law. So everything kind of from housing, workforce development, pollution reduction, energy assistance, transportation, economic development. The state is being asked to look at kind of where those where clean energy or energy efficiency investments are happening in those areas, and essentially ensuring that benefits of those investments are going to communities that would be considered to be disadvantaged. The law provides some framing for how we would consider a community to be disadvantaged. So on the left side of the screen, there's kind of the three primary criteria that the law outlines. So there needs to be a consideration for areas that are burdened by cumulative environmental pollution or other hazards that can lead to negative public health effects, areas with high concentrations of residents that meet a number of socio-demographic criteria, and then also communities that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The Climate Act has put the Climate Justice Working Group in a position to develop the criteria for defining these communities under the law. And that process is currently underway, and we'll speak a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes here. But a little bit more on process. So, I mentioned earlier that, it's really important that, representation from communities is included in the decision-making here. The Climate Justice Working Group is composed of 9 members that are representing environmental justice communities, either upstate or downstate in New York State, as well as 4 state agencies. And the focus on including representation from climate justice or environmental justice communities was to really ensure that the needs and the interests of those communities would be represented in the decision making here when it comes to what we're thinking about in terms of the defining a disadvantaged community. The Climate Justice Working Group is required to host several public input sessions. On the draft criteria, in order to make sure we're getting additional input on what a disadvantaged community looks like, and I'll talk a little bit more about the timelines in a minute. But the expectation is by the end of this year, the Climate Justice Working Group will have established a set of criteria for defining disadvantaged communities. So, when it comes, when it comes to kind of the built environment, and Dr. Allen earlier really articulated this well, and I'm not going to do it any additional justice, but I wanted to make sure that those of you who are kind of working in the design or engineering or building space, we really have an appreciation for why, the built environment matters when it comes to advancing climate justice outcomes. So not only do we see, positive health outcomes associated with, improving the quality of our built environment. So not only air quality, but also vulnerability to, heat or, cold in the winter, given that we're in the Northeast. Looking at opportunities for economic development, so kind of reducing rent burdens or energy burdens, the employment opportunities that could come from jobs, doing this work, to kind of build and retrofit, high performance housing. And then, as we're thinking about kind of the climate act and really putting New York State in a position to be resilient, right, to climate change and extreme weather events. That's another really important kind of aspect of, where buildings play a role here in terms of advancing climate justice. So briefly here, I want to provide an overview of the key work streams related to climate justice under the Climate Act. So we have the Climate Action Council, which Raya will definitely spend more time on. But underneath the Advisory Council, there are a number of advisory panels that are putting together recommendations to help advance the state's policy and programming to help us meet the broader environmental and energy goals outlined in the CLCPA. And these panels all include, representation from environmental justice communities or required to consider how, climate justice can be advanced through those recommendations. Those recommendations will ultimately land in a scoping plan, which will essentially be the roadmap for putting the state in a position to meet the goals of the Climate Act. We spoke about the Climate Justice Working Group already, but just to kind of drill down a little bit more on kind of what's happening there. So I mentioned the development of criteria for establishing, a community that would be considered disadvantaged under the law. That draft criteria is expected to be ready for public comment in early August. So we're getting pretty close to, having some substance to share publicly on that. And then the public comment process will start later in August, and will last through November. While we're working on this development of criteria, the state has put together an interim set of criteria or definition to identify communities that would be considered disadvantaged to help kind of guide agency programming and decision-making until we have this final criteria established. In addition, we have a lot of work happening to help identify how benefits are framed. The goal of 40% of benefits from investments going to disadvantaged communities. There's a number of work streams happening currently to outline kind of what those benefits potentially would look like, what they mean to communities, and how they could be attributed and tracked to these various investments. And then kind of, in parallel, state agencies are currently kind of assessing kind of their program investments and strategies to look at how they could better, address disadvantaged communities.
So Chris, I want to thank you for that brief introduction. I think that's a good point to pass over to Raya Salter, who will pick up on the climate justice movement in New York State and some of the broader set of issues that the Climate Action Council is dealing with. So Raya, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Thank you so much, Chris. And good morning. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for, which is really, I think, an important and hopefully very interesting discussion about really how the 2019 landmark climate law, the CLCPA, shook the ground in New York State and really has some serious, we are having some real turning towards climate action. All right, I was going to say, let's see if I can get this clicker right. Okay, so just a little about me. I was introduced, my bio's available, but I am an attorney. I focus on clean energy advocacy and energy justice. I have a background working in private practice for utilities, and I am now the policy organizer for the New York Renews Climate Justice Coalition, and a member of the New York State Climate Action Council as appointed by leader Andrea Stewart Cousins. So one thing that I think is really important to note about the CLCPA, this landmark climate law, and these justice provisions, it really did come from grassroots advocacy. I'll talk a little bit more about what I like to call sort of the equality, equity, and justice provisions of the CLCPA. But it's really important to note that the New York Renews Coalition and other advocates really pushed through these provisions. And what we have in the end is a climate law unlike any other climate law in the country, and one that also has been very influential on other state climate laws as well as federal policy. This is New York Renews folks and activists demanding the climate justice in 2019, shortly before the passage of the CLCPA. So we saw, I won't go over again, Chris talked about the goals, the goals of the act, the most robust in the country. Washington State has just this year, they're trying to echo away at our title, but it's all right. We are one of the first and few states that are looking at economy-wide carbon reductions. And yes, we are still the only state that has this type of unique energy justice provisions. We talked, again, Chris talked about these targets. They're extremely ambitious. It's incredible to think about 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040, huge investments in building, or huge goals for energy efficiency, building electrification. It's really quite stunning. So Chris also spoke to this one piece. I like to call it a climate justice piece because it's an investment redirect frame. We're talking about how can we direct resources to those who are most impacted and need them most. And that, of course, includes health and equity. So we have this provision that a goal of 40% of climate spending must be directed to disadvantaged communities, as Chris said. This has been very, very influential. The Biden administration has taken on this 40% mandate. We know that state climate policy can be very influential. They call it Justice 40. It's modeled on what happened in New York and what activists put forward. Since we had the law come forward, we've seen these provisions adopted into the New York State Energy Plan, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, NYSERDA's Clean Energy Fund has inserted this spending mandate into a clean energy fund that has yet to be finalized by the Public Service Commission. So there is real movement. Again, a lot of it continues to be pushed by advocates. So one piece that I think is really important to understand, especially with regards to the health equity implications of the CLCPA, are that in order to have a just climate law, a sort of classic renewable portfolio standard plus equity and justice, the law requires that the state and others take equity and justice into consideration as decisions are made. And that importantly includes frameworks to ensure that decisions do not disproportionately burden this term of art. We've got disadvantaged communities, and also that emissions and co-pollutant reductions must be prioritized in disadvantaged communities. And it also sets up some community air monitoring requirements, and it's just to try and get a baseline for what some of this means. Now, I will say that these frameworks are in the law. It has yet to be determined by the state and others how these frameworks about burden, classic environmental justice, equal protection under the law, regardless of race, focusing on those co-pollutant reductions, those environmental health impacts, how those will turn into interagency compliance plans, taking action on these pieces. This is also something that advocates are working very hard to ensure happens. So yes, the Climate Action Council, Chris spoke to that. The statute, again, inserted these provisions for public participation as an energy justice concept, again, coming from the activists at New York Renews and others. So the good news is that there's a very robust process that is happening, but I am very encouraged by, and then Chris mentioned it, so I won't linger too much, but we've got the act that created the Climate Action Council. Very importantly, the Just Transition Working Group, you'll hear more about that later. The Climate Justice Working Group that is working on key criteria and continues to have an ongoing role in this process. Again, Chris really talked about this. And so this is actually something that is really very active and happening right now. And I encourage folks, you can go on the state's website. We can perhaps drop the link in the chat, get alerts, look at meeting materials. If you're a professional or individual or organization who's interested in what's happening with these health and equity provisions, how spending will be redirected, it's time. The time is now, as Chris said. These plans and recommendations are being developed as we speak. So what are some of the other things that are happening that are of concern and importance to several advocates? They're really out of this process, advocates would like to see real firm commitments to ending gas use. And that means that we don't want to see investment in technologies that we broadly call false solutions, which can include, clean hydrogen, clean, renewable natural gas, which many see as an effort to invest now in the infrastructure that will maintain, continue to invest in infrastructure that will maintain fossil fuel infrastructure. There's also real questions into whether or not investing in fossil fuel infrastructure would be compliant with the CLCPA at all. Several are concerned that market-based mechanisms like the transportation TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, and low carbon fuel standard, a sort of a borrowed concept from California, are being raised in the plan as well. And of course, really critically, how are we going to pay for this transition? We've got what is, false solutions aside, a fantastic plan coming together, from these recommendations. How will it be a plan on the shelf? How are we going to pay for this just transition? I won't, Chris spoke again to this timeline, but my message really here is really encouraging folks to get involved in this process. Now is the time where you can look at the recommendations, you can look at some of the recordings, you can see the recordings of the Climate Justice Working Group, and participate. I suspect that if you are involved in this industry, amongst the over 100 advocates, experts that have been impaneled in this process, you probably know someone. It's a great time to get involved and start sharing your thoughts on this plan, because I truly believe without this broad participation, we will not only will we not have a good plan, but we won't actually be able to meet our ambitious goals. Oh, and looks like I have advanced, but that concludes my presentation for now, and I will kick it back to you, Janet. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Raya. And now we're going to move on to Maritza with Align, who's going to share some additional perspective from labor and community groups. So Maritza, over to you.
Hi, Janet, and have everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. What a pleasure and really wonderful to be here with so many wonderful people in this panel. So just to introduce myself a little bit more, and our organization, Align, is the Alliance for a Greater New York. We are an organization that builds long-standing alliances of community organizations, labor unions, environmental justice groups, with the purpose of building not only policy, but also building power through policy to ensure that we have equity, a good equitable economy for everybody. And to that end, I will be talking a little bit today about some of the work that we're doing, recognizing that we are still in a crisis. I'm going to try to see if this works with this clicker. Let's see. Oh, nope, this is not it. Here we go. Next, there you go. So actually, let's go back to this photo. So this is a photo of some of our key allies in our organization. IBEW, the electrical workers, Local 3 in New York and New York City are incredible partners working with community groups like the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, which is one of the photos here, where the rooftop of the facility where IBEW trained workers to be able to get into the renewable economy. So just a little example there of an image that shows the collaboration between the groups that we work with. But getting back to the context in which we're in today, and I think it is important to think about equity and health, understanding what we have gone through. The climate crisis is here. We know the pandemic is still here. We are still living in a crisis. And as others have mentioned earlier, this is not something that has gone the same for everybody. There is rising inequality, 11.4% of unemployment rate in our state. And this past year alone, as the numbers show here, thanks to the NYSERDA study that was released early in the year, we see a slowdown in energy efficiency jobs. So there is a slowdown in our economy as we know it because of this pandemic. But at the same time, we have to recognize that Black and Brown communities have been the ones who have been faced with the most challenging times in terms of the ability to be able to even find healthy homes in the places where they live. So with that, I want to show a little bit on what we've been working with our coalitions. We are part of two large coalitions. One of them is obviously New York Renews. But in New York City, we have been also working with a coalition that was built right after the climate march back in 2014. And through this coalition this year, we recognize the importance of addressing the issue of our economy as much as the health issues by centering our work in three key pillars: centering low-income and brown environmental justice communities as part of the solutions, creating good union jobs within the climate industry, and meeting New York City's 2050 climate goals. So that's how we've been thinking about it in the context of recovery, not forgetting the past and also not forgetting that climate change hasn't gone anywhere, right? And to that end, I'll share the report review that we did earlier in this year. Back in 2019 was a really critical year for our city. We passed important legislations and policy, as we all know, is really important because you have to do policy with government entities, advocacy, as well as groups on the ground. And the way our coalition has been building policy has been from the ground up. One of the key policies that we were talking about earlier today was Local Law 97. Local Law 97 was a policy that I would say is the most ambitious of all of the cities where we have seen in terms of getting some of these large buildings to be able to retrofit, but not only do that, but also create equity and ensure that we create good green jobs. And within that, we include a few pieces in our platform that I think is important to analyze today in terms of the issue areas and how we could potentially come around through a recovery effort that has equity, has health, and at the same time moves us into the implementation of policies that we worked on. Policies are only good as much as we are making them to be implemented. And I'm sure folks here will agree with that. The key pieces here is obviously job creation strategies. Incredibly important to do in terms of retrofitting buildings, in terms of ensuring that all the work that we're doing has some level of funding from the city, from the state, and the federal government. We have such a great opportunity right now, as mentioned earlier, in terms with our federal administration. We know that we have a president who believes that climate change is real, and that is a key component. We have the issues around affordable housing, housing infrastructure improvements, clean transportation expansion, local manufacturing hubs. We've seen some of this great work happening already around offshore wind in areas like the Sunset Park area, incredible work led by groups on the ground in that area, public land development, public waste management, workforce development and training are going to be the ways in which we're going to be able to overcome some of the issues that we have with this pandemic. And this report, you can actually find it on our website at thealignny.org or the Climate Works for All website. But what we're saying here is that at the very least, our city has to invest $16 billion to be able to implement these policies. And we have to be very real in terms of how much do we need to actually invest at the front end to ensure that we create healthy communities and at the same time move us into the implementation of Local 97, implementation of the commercial waste zone systems, which are really critical. And those are also in line with the work that Raya just mentioned around the implementation of CLCPA. We have to have the funding to be able to do that and make sure that the city is actually moving into a swiftly implementation with the projects that are driven by community groups and on the ground. So that's some of the projects that we are working on right now. And then the next piece that I want to talk about a little bit is on green, healthy schools. I think John mentioned earlier, and in terms of how do we think about policy implementation and how do we think about our communities coming together from labor, environmental justice groups, grassroots organizations. I think it's just to think about the buildings that we need to be paying attention to. John mentioned that healthy schools are going to be a key component, and we believe that at this particular moment, there is a huge opportunity for whoever the next mayor will be to move into a swiftly implementation of solar in schools, giving priority for the communities that are considered to be in disadvantage and have less investment given into those communities, ensure that air quality is a number one priority in the context of energy efficiency. That's going to be a really critical point in terms of this next months in terms of how the city invests. So in this context, we have seen in a report we did an analysis in terms of the solar energy that obviously reduces carbon emission, is good for the environment, reduces air pollutants, as a way to also prevent any kind of versions of COVID. As we see, there are variants coming out. Our kids are still not able to get vaccinated in some instances. So where the number one priority has to be at this point is those schools need to be investing on from K to 12 on air quality, investing on HVAC systems as part of the energy efficiency advancement, and the job creation. Right. So the Perry study that estimates for every 1 million spent on energy efficiency retrofit projects, up to 8.7 direct and indirect jobs will be created. So in a time where we know that our economy is facing hard challenges, and we see that there is a need for us to be able to address climate change, we have to combine the solutions here when we think about health, equity, and more importantly, when we think about who can access those jobs. And that has been a key component of all the policies that we have been working on. There is a huge moment right now to create local hiring opportunities. We're working very closely at Align with many building construction trades unions who are at the forefront of the workforce development efforts, working closely with some good contractors in the solar industry who want to do the right thing and actually create those opportunities. So that's how we see the opportunity in terms of advancing good quality jobs, advancing healthy communities, and at the same time ensuring that we move closer and closer to a quicker implementation of the amazing work that our city and our state has been doing. And lastly, just because I have maybe a second left, I want to just emphasize here that our state at this point, we should give each other a pat in our backs. We've been doing an amazing job in terms of creating great policies, amazing work of the advocacy organizations that have been doing great work from years and years, but it's not done. Our state still has less than 6% of renewable energy. And that is something really important to take in consideration. If we actually want to create good, healthy communities, we have to ensure that our energy comes off the fossil fuel industry and ensure that when we move into a just transition, we take in consideration every single stakeholder so that all the unions, community groups, grassroots organizations can actually come to solutions together as part of the implementation, as much as part of new policies that we can be moving forward. And thank you so much again for having me here.
Great. Thank you, Maritza, for that overview. And let's move on now to Adriana, who will share a little bit of the perspective from the New York City Mayor's Office. Adriana, to you.
Thank you so much, Janet, and thank you to Urban Green. My name is Adriana Espinoza. As was mentioned, I'm New York City's Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice, centering equity and health is central to our commitment to New Yorkers. And part of how we do that is developing the tools that help us prioritize equity and health in our work to inform city policy. And there are a few examples that ongoing examples that I can get into a little bit later in the discussion. I'm eager to get to the discussion and Q&A portion. But I'd like to start first by going through the city's environmental justice laws, just to give a quick background of my role within the city. And I think it's important, I think the information that Raya and Chris both shared about the CLCPA and the climate justice work and environmental justice work ongoing at the state level, to understand what the city is doing on these issues. And so my role as Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice is to first and foremost implement the city's 2 environmental justice laws that passed back in 2017. They are local laws 60 and 64. And similarly to the CLCPA, only were made possible from years of grassroots advocacy by environmental justice advocates. And so I'm humbled to be able to work on implementing these laws. And so our mandate is to bake equity and environmental justice into the fabric of how we as a city make decisions. And so that's decisions not just within my office, which is the Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability, but across the administration. And our roadmap for doing that is really threefold. And you can see here on the slide, assemble the team, assess the issues, and then address them by developing a plan. So that we fulfilled this mandate by the creation of 3 distinct products. The first being the Environmental Justice for All report, which you can think of as an analysis or an assessment of the current state of environmental justice in New York City. And I'll get into in a moment a little bit more about what that means and what's all encapsulated in that report. But the second, that's the first product, is the report. The second is bringing that analysis and that data to the public through the creation of an environmental justice online portal and mapping tool. So think similarly to EPA's EJ screen, where we provide information on the city's environmental justice laws, ongoing programs that the city has in those areas, and then access to be able to view, map, and download the city's own environmental justice data that we used in our assessments, so that advocates can use that, or community-based organizations can use that in their own efforts, or community-based planning efforts. And then the third and final product of the environmental justice program in the city is to develop a citywide comprehensive environmental justice plan. And so that's where we take the assessment and the analysis, right, and incorporate that into discrete recommendations for how to actually change or reform the way we make decisions in the city of New York. So these recommendations can be internal to city agencies, and how to change the way that we engage with communities, the way we define equity or prioritize environmental justice. There could also be external recommendations in the plan as well for citywide initiatives to advance environmental justice, or hyper-local initiatives to address any number of health and environmental disparities that could have been that had been highlighted through the report process. So we're currently in the assessment phase, which I'll get into in just a moment. See if I can advance this slide here. Looks like it's not going. Is it going on your end? Oh, there we go. Thank you. just wanted to take a quick second to give you a sense of who this team is. I'm here in the center as a senior advisor for environmental justice. My role is managing the process and sort of convening the rest of the team. And the rest of the team includes the interagency working group, which right now has 20 different city agencies whose role and responsibility it is to actually develop the report, the portal, and the plan, to do the analysis and the research and the writing of those products. We also have, importantly, an environmental justice advisory board, of which Peggy Shepard of We Act for Environmental Justice, who gave the keynote this morning, is the chair. And the role of the advisory board is critical. It's to advise and review, advise the city as we develop these products, and critically, it's also to lead the public engagement work around this issue, to make sure that in every step of the way in creating these processes that are these products, that frontline communities and environmental justice communities priorities are uplifted, considered, and adopted in these 3 products. So just briefly here on the environmental justice report, I mentioned a moment ago, that's where we currently are, is in scoping out the environmental justice for all report. And what that means is sort of deciding what are the issues we're going to cover, how are we proposing to analyze them. And there are legal minimum requirements we have to cover. But they all fit within 3 main buckets. The first one is assessing environmental outcome. This is the meat of the report, the analysis of defining what are New York City's environmental justice concerns, and then conducting an analysis of where these issues are manifesting around the city, where they are compounding upon each other. That can include environmental issues like proximity to heavy polluting infrastructure, also can include proximity to parks and open green space, also climate vulnerabilities and how these things are compounding on top of each other. That's sort of the first bucket of the report. The second is examining the city's contribution to environmental justice. So what are the ways in which the city government as an entity helped to advance or to create or exacerbate the environmental disparities and inequality that we see in the city, and really examining our policies, our programs, our processes, and our activities, and taking a critical eye there. And that's another, I think, just reason why I'll underscore the importance of having both my internal team, the interagency working group, and an external environmental justice advisory board in sort of balancing out this sort of review of city government's role in environmental justice and environmental racism. And then the final bucket of the report is public engagement with communities. And that element of the report is going to analyze the way in which the city shows up and engages with communities in environmental decision-making specifically, and the extent to which environmental justice communities and frontline communities have a seat at the table and levers of power over decision-making about shaping their own communities. And so these are the 3 main buckets that the Environmental Justice for All report will look at. And I wanted to close here with just sharing with you all how public input will shape this work. I feel, very strongly that environmental justice is not something a government can do on its own, and has to come in co-creation with the public. And so what we have done is, in partnership with the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, is build public engagement processes into every step of this work, well above and beyond the legal minimum requirements for our public engagement. So we started out early this year with a public comment period, a very open public comment period to hear from folks, particularly in the city's environmental justice areas, or what are the priority issues that you want to see covered in the environmental justice for all report. That way, whenever we started scoping out, we did that before we started scoping out the work. That way, we weren't in a situation where the city government was deciding for ourselves, this is what we think the environmental justice concerns are for the city, but we were first starting from a foundation of what do New Yorkers want to see covered in this report. And so that public comment period, a 90-day public comment period, helped to inform the development of the scope. I'm hoping very soon to be able to release a draft version of that scope this summer, which will then kick off another public comment period where New Yorkers can actually see how their comments were taken and put into the scope. And then we will work then to start drafting up the report itself, which I'm hoping to have a public draft version by the end of this calendar year. And again, we'll then kick off a whole nother round of public engagement, town halls in every borough, and public comment period. And then, so that's sort of the public engagement for the report. And then after that, for developing the plan, I think it's equally important to also have public input shape the solutions that come out of the city's environmental justice program. And so there will be opportunities to propose solutions for the EJ plan throughout 2022. And I will just close by saying that this is the first time that the city is sort of creating these environmental justice products, but that this work is mandated to be repeated every 5 years in the city of New York. So thank you so much to Urban Green, and I'll turn it back over to you, Janet.
Great. Thank you, Adriana. And let's jump now into a conversation. And I would encourage the audience participants to enter questions into the app, and we will get to those shortly. But I'll kick off with a few. So I want to dig a little bit more into the very recent experience associated with the pandemic in terms of, what have we learned that we can carry forward as it relates to health, climate, and equity. Maritza, you talked a bit about an opportunity to improve our schools, and maybe that's a great nexus of dealing with our climate issue and dealing with our health and equity issue. But I would like to open it up to the panel, maybe Maritza, Adriana, and others, tangibly, what is fresh in our mind that we can bring forward from this recent pandemic experience as it relates to really integrating health and climate and equity in a real world way?
Well, I'll give a quick answer. I think that it exposed a glaring need to address energy affordability. And in particular, folks can't afford their energy. This piece about shutoffs and preventing shutoffs is incredibly important. And I think there's a missed opportunity, that we need in our climate work. We need to be working on these access issues in particular in an ongoing way. And there's a missed opportunity if we don't tackle that in the first instance.
Yeah.
I could build a little bit more on the question about the schools, but in general, I think health and safety is really critical for all of our communities, right? And I think during this pandemic, what we've seen a lot of is that there's a lot of unknowns. So there has not been open discussions or conversations with our workforce in terms of what kind of health and safety workplaces do they have, right? So that's something to think about in the context of energy efficiency, not only for the schools, but for the entire, sector in the buildings, right? Like we have public buildings right now who require and need so much infrastructure that needs to be built in terms of capital support, right? Aside from that, I think there are some efforts right now. Folks are talking about the new Green New Deal for public housing. I think in prioritizing air quality also, aside from the basic needs of public housing, is going to be critical, especially right now. Because the pandemic, like I said earlier today, the pandemic isn't over yet, right? Like, so we're still faced with variants that are coming. This is such a disease that nobody understands it completely, right? Like, we're still learning so much about it. So it's important to just improve the air quality of all of our buildings in the context of energy efficiency as a whole. Prioritizing, as I mentioned earlier today, the communities that have been impacted the most, where there is there's a lot of less infrastructure investment in communities of color, right? So I think we need to prioritize the investment there. And lastly, I would say part of the recovery of this economic crisis, it's how do we think about rebuilding our economy in a different way? We cannot just think about just building, renewable energies and we are all great. Right? Renewable energy has to actually be a pathway for a recreation of the way we treat our workforce, for the way in which we want our economy to function. So I think there is a little bit about, yes, the health and safety issues. And at the same time, how do we really want to have our economy moving forward with green, really healthy economies overall, not only in one sector or two sectors? We have to see it as a big picture.
I'd like to add to that a little. I agree with both everything that Maritza and Raya said. I'd say for me that a big lesson learned from this is the importance of doing the groundwork on understanding systemic inequality. We cannot wait until an emergency situation to understand our vulnerabilities and disparities. We have to do that groundwork ahead of time to enable immediate action in times of crisis. And I think one specific example that I can give as that underscored this for me during the pandemic is the work, the amazing work of this New York City's Department of Health in partnership with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability and Resiliency is on the Heat Vulnerability Index. Well before the pandemic started, we had this tool already created that understood heat vulnerability in New York City and who was most at risk for dying during events of extreme heat. And that it's a statistical model that looks at surface temperature, green space, but also social and economic vulnerabilities such as access to air conditioning in the home and percentage of residents who are low income and non-Latinx Black population, which we know is the most vulnerable population to heat. And so because we had that groundwork and we had that tool available to us in the city of New York, in the midst of this pandemic, when we're telling folks to stay home and stay indoors and closing in a situation where we had to close cooling centers, we were able to, in building out our Cool Neighborhoods and Cool Streets programs and an emergency declaration that enabled the city to do a free air conditioning program. We had the data and the tools on hand to know who is most vulnerable, where do we need to prioritize our outreach and engagement to make sure that we're getting these ACs into our highest heat vulnerable neighborhoods. And so my role is to push the city to do more like this, but also to go beyond just creating the tools as well. I think if I can have one takeaway for the panel, it would be that centering equity in our work is critical, but centering equity does not equal justice, and it does not equal environmental justice. And I think where I'd like to push beyond that is to, in the development of these tools, bring those tools to communities and work with them to develop the solutions.
Thanks, Adriana. A lot of great points in there. I'd like to maybe pick up on two threads, and then we're going to jump to some audience questions. So the one thread I want to pick up on is the importance of increased and equitable community engagement Peggy spoke to it in her opening remarks, and every speaker has touched on it. And I don't think there's any disagreement that we need more engagement. Communities need to be able and be empowered to have a greater say in their future. How do we do this? What is the best and most effective and most equitable way of engaging the very diverse communities that we have to achieve that end of sort of co-development, co-ownership? I'd like to hear some reactions from a number of you. I think we're all aligned. We need to do it. How do we do it effectively? And are there really good models? Again, tangible models that we can point to.
Well, I can definitely quickly say that real public education, public and popular education, which would include substantive outreach from agencies, in addition to, this is a PR effort, this is a practice effort, it's a cultural shift in the first instance. In another instance, things that we've been asking for a while, a budget is a plan. Like say at the Public Service Commission, intervenor compensation. Sometimes there's an idea that deep community engagement, and particularly in disadvantaged communities, is the tip of the spear, yet there's this expectation that the folks who are probably have the least resources will just sort of pony up and show up and provide all this information. So there really needs to be ways to compensate and empower folks with expertise, with funds. It could be more positions, paid positions doing this work. So that is my initial answer.
Thanks, Raya. Anyone else to add to that?
And I'll build on that a little bit as well. I think the other, in addition to education, the other thing that, we've seen at NYSERDA is, technical capacity is limited for a number of, community-based organizations and frontline communities. So, as we're thinking about, how to build capacity and to resource, we really need to look at, how to, position community-based organizations and, in their constituents to, understand, kind of not only the regulatory process, right? Because that can be very difficult to navigate, especially for those of us who work in this space. So imagine what it looks like for communities. But then also, providing, resources to assist with, technical kind of expertise as they want to provide comments on, clean energy or,
like I said,
policy.
Intervenor compensation, a budget is a plan.
The one thing that I would add, Janet, thank you for those. I think I completely agree on I like the idea the budget is a plan, Raya. That's awesome. I do think that there is something that we need to say here. I think the communities that have been impacted the most by climate change, by systems of operations, and are the ones who know what they need. Mm-hmm. And the traditional way of engagement, as we've seen it so much lately, is just the top down. Let me create the plan, let me do the thing, and I'm going to come and ask you. And then I'm going to select the groups, and I'm going to select the people who might know a little bit here and there so that they can tell me what to do, right? So there has to be a little bit more of a depth. So I think it is an understanding of what people actually need by listening to people impacted, not by telling people what to do. And I would want to say this, I heard this comment once in some of the work that I've done about the term innovation, right? And how that term can sound really good, but it becomes complicated when the innovation trumps any efforts to really get to the core issues that communities are facing, right? So if coming in is just similar thing as gentrification in a way. Yeah, I'm going to stop there.
So thank you, Maritza, and thank you for the comments on that. And I want to pick up one other thread, and that is around the health integration topic. Do we have any good models of programs, initiatives, and policies that have integrated health with energy policy, clean energy policy? Do we have programs, models, policies that we can build on, that we can try to emulate, that we can spring from? So maybe open that up.
So I can start with that. So one of the initiatives that is currently underway within New York State is a partnership between NYSERDA and the Department of Health, looking at how we can better integrate healthy homes kind of improvements kind of with our energy efficiency programs. And the specific pilot that we're undertaking right now is really targeting Medicaid clients and looking at how we could validate the healthcare cost savings tied to doing healthy homes interventions targeting asthma trigger reduction as a place to start, with the idea that we could get healthy homes improvements, energy efficiency plus health, kind of incorporated as a standard kind of offer or a preventative investment through the health system. So that's one of the I guess closest initiatives that we're aware of here. But it's certainly something that in other states we know that the states are looking at ways to better integrate health and energy programming. So that's one.
Thanks, Chris. That's a great model. Any other models that the panelists are familiar with or aware of that we should be looking to emulate?
Wow. So we know what, in particular, energy efficiency, retrofits with the healthy homes wraparound. We know what the impacts will be. Getting gas out of gas, getting gas out of our distribution system is another piece. So while yes, there are models, I think that we know what we need to do. And a big piece of it is getting started. And an area of increasingly important and emerging area is this front-end service provision. How do we enable our service providers to really effectively deliver services? And that's another area, I think, where some real development could and modeling could be done.
Great. Well, I want to pivot to a question from the audience. And this is asking, how do we quantify improvements in environmental justice, and what are the kinds of metrics that we should be looking toward? So open that up to the panel.
So I could start with some of the thinking that is currently taking place in the context of the benefits framework, as we're thinking about communities benefiting from clean energy and energy efficiency investments. So we're looking at obviously the level of spending that is going into communities, but in addition to that, looking at how we can measure economic development that is happening through these investments. So whether that's job creation, an increase in wages, for communities, and then looking at health impacts such as improvements in kind of air quality, right? So if we're able to reduce emissions, within the community, peaker plants, transportation, looking at measuring kind of those outcomes. So that's kind of a place to start. Also looking at, potentially, impacts for individual residents and households, like, energy bill reduction, so on and so forth. So that's currently what the team working on the Climate Act implementation is considering.
Yeah, and let me add, again, this is an area where we know a lot. We know what we need to do. And the law requires early action on emissions and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities, our sort of term of art. And it requires this air monitoring programs, and we have the technology and ability to do this monitoring. And one of the big areas that you will hear me continue to talk about on the Climate Action Council in terms of our plan is putting those markers in our timeline for those emissions and co-pollutant reductions and developing the metrics and markers that need to be in place. And some of that is working on the social science piece in that intersection. And it can be done, and we need to do more of it. And we need to make sure, for example, our renewable energy program, our clean energy standard as it marches forward, is accountable to that early action on emissions and co-pollutant reductions. So my emphasis here is that this is a overarching requirement, not a piecemeal sort of here's what, things that we can put together. Some of it we haven't figured out yet, but we have the power to do it and the obligation to do it.
Right. If I could just add to that, Janet. So a lot of this work is happening on the state level right now through the Climate Justice Working Group. And, we are also thinking through it on the city level as well in the context of the Environmental Justice for All report, particularly in how we assess the city's contribution to environmental justice. And I don't want to get too far ahead of my own scope here, but some of the things that we're looking at do sound similar to what I heard Raya and Chris go over, which is, when we're assessing this city's contribution to environmental justice, what are we looking at? How are the environmental outcomes and the health outcomes? Yes, those are important, but also procedural justice as well. And what does the budget look like for this program? What is the longevity of this program? Is it a one-off, one-year program, or is it more long-term? And was equity and environmental justice considered at the beginning when this program or policy was being developed, or are we only in hindsight looking back at it? Those are sort of the metrics that we're developing for ourselves, which is interesting because it does sound similar to some of the things that are being considered on the state level as well.
Thank you. Another question to the panel from the audience, and this is a big one. Transforming our energy system requires significant investment. What practical policy steps can we take to address and ensure energy affordability?
Energy is a human right. Let's talk about it. Let's pay for it. Let's make sure people have access. Let's make sure people can turn their lights on. That's one thing I would say.
Well,
California, not trying to say they're perfect because they're not, but they see, that having having that heating and cooling supply is a human right. It's a lot of mess what's happened out there, but they've done a lot of requirements relating to that as well.
So one thing that I will add, which I think it is important to think about our public goods and specifically our, city buildings, right? Like we do have a huge ability here to take care of the renewable energy sector by creating large scale. Taking care of large buildings, particularly public buildings, ensuring that the public energy that we can create through the sun continues to be public. Let's make sure that private investors who want to engage in our city infrastructure are the ones who are going to be getting all the benefits. And let's make sure that when we talk about creating jobs for our communities, are actually good jobs with long career jobs, like labor standards. Those kind of things would actually allow for us to have a different kind of energy economy as a whole.
I think another, practical solution here that we need to think about it is also the ways in which we help low-income New Yorkers afford their utility bills. We have this light heat program, right, that is funded on the federal level. Those funds then go to the state level, and then the state distributes those funds. And the funds are going to help with heat assistance and then also with cooling. And this all comes from the same funds. And so we have the dog days of summer competing with the coldest days of winter. And that is not just, especially in a changing climate, that we have, if all of the funds run out because we have a very cold winter and all of those funds get distributed to help people with their heating bill, then that's less the less funds that are available to help people pay for cooling or pay to even turn on their AC if they have the privilege of having air conditioning in the first place. And so that, I think, is something that that funding stream and that process for how those monies are looked at is ripe for reform.
There's nowhere near enough of that money either. And we need more from the feds and from the state. It doesn't go anywhere close to covering the need.
And maybe in addition to, obviously increased resources to address, higher energy bills, there's also, making sure that we're weatherizing and we're, providing, low income households with the ability to reduce their consumption, right? So when we're talking about all of the co-benefits of weatherization, so it's not just kind of lower energy bills, but it's also improved health outcomes, for the home. So kind of, with the theme that we started this morning, that's another practical solution, although, that also requires resources to scale, right?
Well, I think we have time for one more question before we break. So we're going to open this one up to the full panel. We talk a lot about, the multiple crises that we are facing, and they're real, they're upon us, and they are, in many cases and instances, sometimes feel overwhelming. So I'm going to try to turn that one upside down. I think the fact that we're having this conversation about the needs and the opportunities to integrate health, equity, and climate is a positive step. And I guess I'd like to ask each of you, what are you most optimistic about in terms of prospects for making real progress on this front? So please jump in.
I'm optimistic about this moment that we're in, where we seem to be talking about justice and race and cumulative impacts and environmental justice in a way I think that hasn't been done before. I'm optimistic about the good plans that are coming together and the opportunity to engage. That's something in particular, both young people and the public at large, and public education, and my personal thing that is in deep investments in our educational institutions and training institutions. Which is, I think, the way that we will get to this transformation. So as discouraging and difficult as this time is, I am just so encouraged by the agency that we have in the moment.
I could add to that. I agree with Raya. I am optimistic about this moment that we're in. And that, I think, as you put it, Janet, that we're having this conversation now. And the only reason we're having this conversation now is because there's been decades of groundwork by grassroots environmental justice organizations who have been centering equity and health in their policy and advocacy for generations at this point. And I'm optimistic that that the voice is being heard, that there seems to be intentional space created for this listening. And I hope that I'm optimistic that in having this conversation, in doing this listening, it also means we're ready to have these voices lead and not just listen to what these ideas are, but let them create the solutions and lead the way.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just offer, I think what I'm most, optimistic about is the fact that, there is momentum, right? So, it has taken a while to get to this point, but, we have really good engagement from communities. Obviously, we need to do a better job of, improving opportunities for engagement, but, we have a good starting point now, and it's really a matter of how do we bring in those voices and, build this, infrastructure to address the multiple, kind of issues and priorities that we have.
Maritza, would you like to have the last word on this?
Sure. I'm optimistic about the opportunities that we can create when we actually work together. I think that we have experienced one of the worst pandemics ever of the generations. So it gives us a moment to think about what can we do differently? So in terms of this issue of climate change, I think that people are invested. I'm very optimistic to be able to see our partners in the labor movement engaging deeply by the minute in terms of what kind of a just transition we can see created and how much the issue of race is part of the conversation. I think racial justice and climate justice are intersected. And for our state to be able to address those problems, we need to make sure that the conversations are happening across sectors, across communities. And I think we can do it. But again, emphasizing the piece around from the ground up. That's the only way we're going to do it, and shifting the status quo. I think we can do it. And thank you so much for having me here.
Okay, well, that's a great way to close out this session. I want to thank the panelists for participating. I think it is tremendous that we are having this conversation, and we need to seize this moment and make that progress and deliver on that. So thank you, everyone. And with that, we pass back to our main organizers, and I believe we have a 10-minute break in the program. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Janet. Thank you to everybody on that policy panel for a really insightful discussion. As Janet mentioned, we're at the point for our second 10-minute break. So everybody stand, everybody stretch, everybody refresh your coffee if you like. But then hurry on back because we have a fantastic second panel that's going to look at how we build health and equity into electrification. So we'll see you in 10 minutes.